Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and some books. Today we are continuing Boxcar Bertha. Let me see if I can get this lighting a little better here. Alright, let's try that. And so, this is As Told to Dr. Ben L. Reitman. This is chapter 5. A week later, Ina, her poet lover, and I got a ride with the sister of one of the men in Schrader's office as far as Alton, Illinois, and from Alton got an empty boxcar with 2 men hobos on a midnight freight. It was a bumpy ride, full of scrapings and stoppings at every little jerkwater town in Illinois. Toward morning, a brakie found us, but we gave him 50 cents apiece to shut him up. We ran into the only woman on this trip, but her story was worth all the discomfort we had. She and 2 tall, lanky southern male hobos, all of them drawing in their talk, got on toward morning when we stopped and switched about in a little spot. The brakie had tipped us off that we had about an hour's wait, and we had gotten out to stretch ourselves. As it was getting late, we walked around the quiet streets and up past the little red brick store buildings and on the courthouse square that men had been hitching posts around. When we got back in our boxcar, we found the girl and 2 men there before us. Her name was Virginia Hargraves. She was thin, raw-boned, and rather attractive in her overalls and heavy boy's sweater. Her husband had left her, and she had attached herself to these 2 older men hobos and was trying to get to Chicago, where a girlfriend of hers had a job in a house. She said the 2 men had helped her all the way from Alabama. Part of the time they had come in boxcars, part of the time on the road hitchhiking. They had hustled food for her, and in return she had given them what sex expression they wanted. She was pretty cynical about men generally. After the train got rolling, she told me how she lost her husband on her first hobo trip, on her wedding night. Virginia was 17 and had lived all her life in a small Georgia town. Hargraves was the son of a farmer who had been dispossessed. They scraped together $5, bought a marriage license, gave the preacher 50 cents to marry them, and immediately after the ceremony hopped on a freight train, intending on spending their honeymoon with relatives in Alabama. When they got on the freight, it was already moving, so they climbed up the ladder and got on top of an empty. It started to rain and soon poured down. They decided to swing down from the top and jump inside, a feat quite common among hobos and sisters of the road. Hargraves held on to his wife's hands while she swung over the roof of the car and let her body down. She was in overalls. As her legs began to descend, a pair of arms took hold of them and helped her into their car. Her husband attempted to follow her, but the train had gained speed and was jerking so badly that he was afraid he couldn't make it. He put one leg down slowly, then yelled after her, "I can't do it! I'll fall off!" He swung back and flattened himself on the top of the car, holding the sides for support. Hanging over the edge, he looked inside the car. What he saw made him wild. The arms that held his wife down belonged to a male hobo and were now around Virginia, struggling with her. But Hargreaves wasn't man enough to make another attempt to do anything about it. He simply lay there and watched while the hobo raped his wife. The train thundered on 100 miles through the mountains. Finally, when they came near a small town and the train slowed down to about 20 miles an hour, the hobo jumped off. When the train stopped, Hargreaves climbed down to his wife. He was beside himself with rage. You had no business leaving me on top of the car, he shouted. It was your fault. You sure as hell can't beat it. I'm going back. And he did. Virginia and her men were willing to risk the railroad digs in Chicago, but Ina's poet had been picked up twice in the yards there, so we got off the train when it slowed up in Berwyn and rode into the city on a streetcar. We had sent our luggage on by American Express and walked through the loop to get it on Randolph Street. Ina's poet suggested we go over to the near north side, near the Dill Pickle Club and Bughouse Square. Here we found a little 3-room housekeeping apartment with 2 beds and proceeded to settle down and look around. The first thing I did was hunt for Malatini. I could find no trace of him. I wrote to the paper of which he was the editor and got an evasive answer. The last we heard of our comrade, he was touring the South. I had $50, which Schrader had given me, and for about a month we bummed around the city doing nothing. We spent much of our time in front of the Drake, the hotel that later played an important part in my life. In the evening we drifted over to the infamous Bughouse Square, in front of the Newberry Library on Walton Place, between Clark and Dearborn Streets, where there were always exciting soapbox orators who said what they pleased and always found an audience. No less than 10 men who spoke there that first summer claimed to be the king of hobos. Oh, not less than 10 claimed to be the king of hobos. One, who signed himself Dan O'Brien, Rex, an Irishman with fine distinguished head who was 70 years old, always said that he was going to run for president. But the night I heard him, he admitted that if the crowd didn't give him a good collection, he'd have to carry the banner. Another king of the hobos I had heard was Al Kaufman, a stuttering, handsome Jew of 25, who claimed to have traveled 300,000 miles on 30 cents in his nerve. Another was Thomas Fitzgerald, a shriveled hobo of 50 who had tramped through every state in America and had been in 50 jails. By far the handsomest of these kings was Gus Shaffey, a scholar, an actor, and an impresario. When anyone challenged his kingdom, he quoted, "They can copy my ships, but not my brain." The best-known king was Jeff Davis of Cincinnati. He was a tall, loose-jointed, partially bald, humorous in face and speech, with a flair for organizing. He had a passion for denouncing all other kings and for getting his name in the newspapers and the movies. Later, I attended several of his hobo conventions and saw him just a few months ago in Pittsburgh in charge of the big hobo jungle jamboree of the 27th conclave of International Itinerant Workers Union. That summer, there were also a number of women, each of whom claimed the title Queen of the Hobos. Among these were 2 elderly women who were not only queens but champions of the working class. Both were widows of Chicago anarchists of Weimar riot fame who were hanged November 11th, 1887. Oh, Haymarket riot. Sorry, that was a bad ink spot. The better known of these 2 was Lucy Parsons, who invited me to her home and gave me a copy of her book, The Life of Albert Parsons. Her skin was quite clay-colored, like that of a Mexican. I learned that she was born in El Paso and had a full-blooded Indian father. She was bent over with age, yet her hair was hardly gray at all. I got a big thrill out of hearing from her speeches, the speeches of the earlier Chicago anarchists, and her husband and Louis Ling, when they were on trial for their lives. The other anarchist widow was Nina Van Zandt Spies, a large, breezy woman who wore many underskirts and walked with a cane and always had her hair flying about from under a pokey hat. Formerly she had been very beautiful, they told me. When I knew her, she wore bifocal glasses and peered over them intently. She harbored many stray dogs and cats in her apartment, and the story went until the health department interfered. She had kept a horse there, too. She had a voice that sounded aristocratic. Whenever she spoke in Bughouse Square, she thrilled her audiences and told the story of how they murdered my dear innocent husband. The most popular queen was Red Martha, keeper of the famous Martha Beegler boarding house. Her place reminded me of my own mother's, Mother Thompson's boarding house. Red Martha was originally from a little town in Illinois and had taught in the Socialist League. She was short and fat when I knew her, with her red hair graying. She had been a typesetter. Practically all of the more or less intellectual hobos and sisters of the road who have visited Chicago in the last 20 years have stayed at her place. When any of us hobo girls were broke or hungry, we always knew where we could get a meal and a bed, no questions asked. By far, the best known of the queens was Lizzie Davis. I saw her that first summer and later in New York, and got the end of her story after a long time back in Chicago. Lizzie was a large girl, with shoulders as broad as a man's. She was not bad looking, but was not the type of girl men chose on the dance floor. She was born in Tennessee in the late 90s, from an enviable American racial stock, but from an environment that, our professors say, is often the primary factor in the production of maladjusted and the malcontent, a home in which there was domestic discord and desertion. In addition, she had a nervous, puritanical, inexperienced mother who had a tremendous struggle to provide for her children. As a child, Lizzie was timid, imaginative, and misunderstood, she said. The urge of love and life and the desire for freedom and adventure was always burning in her soul. And yet, in a small country town, there was no place for expression. At 17, she attempted to escape by way of the matrimony and found out what so many women have learned to their sorrow, that those who marry to escape drabness and the monotony of existence only find themselves in a worse jam. Through devious paths, she found herself on the road as a hobo. Lizzie has known practically every kind of social outcast that is mentioned in the police record. She had also met the other groups of higher-up and distinguished students, including professors, Freudian analysts, and novelists. She often quoted, "God, what things there are I haven't done to find a little adventure, love, and peace." She told me her story several years ago when I ran into her in Cleveland. "I've been everywhere hoboing, traveling the freights on deck," she said, "and the boxcars, rode the bumpers, rode the engine and the cow catchers. I've beat the passenger trains by telling the conductor I lost my ticket, by hiding in the ladies' toilet, and by riding the blinds and decking it. I made it to the 20th century right out of the Grand Central Depot. When it comes to hitchhiking, there's nothing to it. Anything with a skirt on can hitchhike. I go down between New York and Chicago just like a businessman. It never takes me more than 3 days, and I always end up with more money than when I started. I go down to Palm Beach and Muscle Shoals in automobiles just as if I owned a fleet of them. I'm no beauty, and I never wear very good clothes, but I bet just as many men make love to me and try to sleep with me as they try to make with the beauties." Lizzie's claims were fame to many. She did not like many women on the road whose place in the sun depends upon the fame of their lovers, and she had a group of sweethearts as fine as a group of men as ever went unhung. Lizzie was a genius in her own right. She was a grand scandalmonger, and she did not like her scandal vicariously. She liked it straight. She knew the dirt about everybody. She knew if a man was queer, or if a woman would take money or drinks for favors. She knew the best neighborhood for panhandlers, and when hostile bulls were on the beat. The lesbians and the fairies and the queens could keep nothing from her. If there was anything radical, questionable, dangerous, or sordid in the neighborhood, Lizzie was always a part of it. If there was any new, perverted, vicious, crooked, antisocial, terrible men in the community, Lizzie wanted them as lovers. Her love for the abnormal, the seared, and the sordid was only equaled by her admiration for the good literature and scientific psychological research. Her devotion to the notorious gangster was only paralleled by her devotion to her son. For Lizzie had a son. That is, she gave birth to a son. Really, she never had him. The man who was his father knew Lizzie too well to let her bring up the boy. Lizzie's son was brought up in private schools, in special schools. He went to 40 schools in 20 states and was kicked out of most of them. He was Lizzie's son, and he wanted to be with his mother, but the father, who was also a queer duck and lived on the fringe of criminal racketeering, spent his money on the kids' schooling and always had a $5 or $10 bill for Lizzie. She always reminded me of a large turbine engine throbbing away. She had tremendous sex appeal, and in spite of her 170 pounds and her ill-fitting shabby gowns, she'd steal a new dress, and in 2 days it would look as though it had been slept in for a month. I've heard more than one woman say, "How in the hell can them fine-looking young men stand for that woman?" Her chief asset, and the most outstanding thing about her, was her naturalness. It was not in her to be artificial or conventional. She had an uncanny ability to understand the psychology and behavior of social outcasts. She'd be walking down the street and meet a group of perverts, and in 5 minutes they'd be standing on the street telling her everything they knew. They confessed their sins and their hopes to her. Often she would meet a prostitute, get acquainted with her, and go home with her and stay up all night and day talking. She would often watch how the girl turned her tricks. She knew all about prostitution, but she was never a prostitute herself. She was very popular, and yet very much hated by the IWW and labor leaders. She was often invited to their conferences. Men could talk freely and bitterly when she was in the room. The drunks liked to have her around because she always stayed sober, and when their money was gone, she knew how to get a bottle on tick. A group of gangsters, conspiring to rob and kill, would permit Lizzie to stay in the room, having a full confidence that she not betray them. She was fearless and suspicionless. She had all the faith of a Seventh-day Adventist that she would get out of a jam. One day she burglarized a home and was caught in the act by the police and dragged to the station. The next morning, she looked the judge square in the face and said, "Yes, I broke into that home to get some letters that my lover had written to one of your high school teachers." The judge believed her, turned her loose, and the schoolbird turned a high school teacher loose the next day. She was a shoplifter and seemed so clumsy at it that everyone marveled she didn't get caught, but she never did. She would go into a department store and paw over a lot of lovely gowns, find one that fit her, put it on under her arm, and walk away with it. She not only stole her own clothes, but when she'd meet some poor ragged outcast, man or woman, she'd say, "Come along with me and I'll get you some clothes." She always made her offer good. She was a crude panhandler. She looked overly well-fed, was haughty and often insulting. She had a simple technique when panhandling. "Mister, wouldn't you like to give me 25 cents? She'd gurgle a smile and approach a stranger. "I need 50 cents for my room rent." Although she begged considerably, she never liked it. She followed her primary behavior pattern. She was the 4th generation of hard-working American women, and she worked when she wanted to. She was a stenographer and typist. Most of the time, she worked in the better shops and offices where they needed someone to address envelopes. Lizzie could do 2,000 envelopes a day. She could sit at a machine and type for 15 hours straight. She would get tired of working and hobo for a time and become weary of hoboing and work. There was no peace for her. No matter what she did, no man satisfied her, no matter how much she loved him. We met a number of homosexuals that summer, both male and female. There were several tea shops and bootleg joints in the near north side of Chicago that catered to lesbians. But I didn't like most of these women. There was only one that I became well acquainted with, and she told me her story. She called herself Yvonne the Chigain. She said she was a gypsy, come from a family of migratory entertainers. She was born in Paris, France. Her mother was a dancer from Russia. Her father was a well-known artist. She was trained as an acrobatic split dancer and came to America in 1921 with a troupe of dancers and played all over the Keith circuit, now known as the Orpheum. But she became tired of the stage and in 1925 took to the road. Her first trip from coast to coast in 1925 took her 18 days. When she was 13 years old, she seduced a woman and lived with her for 2 years. Then she had several lesbian relationships which lasted varying lengths of time. She had had one male lover also and had borne a child by him, but the child had died. She seemed to feel that there was little difference between a heterosexual and a homosexual relationship. On the whole, she felt heterosexual relationship was better for the woman since she believed that men were more dependable than women. She said that there were a number of lesbians on the road and that they usually traveled in small groups. Apparently, they had little difficulty in getting rides or obtaining food. The majority of automobilists, she said, sensed that they were queer and made very little effort to become familiar. She told me that among the lesbians on the road, there were always a number who were bisexual, that is, who liked both men and women, and also another group who were prostitutes, selling themselves to men for money, but having women sweethearts. Many of the lesbians in Chicago hunted in packs and traveled in automobiles. There was a group of these who had a magnificent apartment on North Dearborn Street near the park. I met a number of them there at a soiree called Mickey Mouse's Party. Half a dozen of them were wealthy women. 4 of these were legally married and 2 of the 4 had children. They were ostensibly there as sightseers, but actually they had more than a superficial interest in these lesbian girls, but they were constantly being exploited. The lesbians would get their names and addresses and borrow money by saying, "I met you at Mickey Mouse's party." Besides the kings and the queens, there were hundreds, not dozens, but hundreds of articulate hobos who spoke on the square. Drunk or sober, ragged, and awful unable to speak clear English, they could always get a crowd to listen to what they had to say. Many speeches started with, "When I was in Leavenworth," or "When I was in the can in Detroit," or "When they had me locked in New York," and "Fellow workers, I just came in from a hobo trip," or "I haven't worked for 17 years, I'm staying down at the shelter house," and many of them began, "For the last 3 weeks I've been sleeping in Grant Park." Not only did the hobos talk about themselves, but everybody else talked about the hobos and unemployment. Several of the regular speakers were brilliant. John Burns, tall and lanky and hatchet-faced, had a powerful way of talking. He had the manner of a politician, and I learned that he often electioneered for the Republican campaigns. He understood and explained the psychology of the hobo, the gangster, and the criminal. Happy Jimmy Rowan, an IWW veteran, told convincing stories of early hobo hardships. David Tolman, a short, stocky Jew with horn-rimmed glasses, knew a great deal about history, economics, and psychology, and talked on these subjects with wit and humor and many long words. He had much to say about hobos. All of this was an education to me, not only at Bughouse Square, but at many forums, hobos and vagrancy were the chief topics of discussion. Always after meetings on the street, or at the square, or at the Bug Club in Washington Park, or in any of the forums, a crowd of speakers and initiates would get together in the penny cafeteria, or in the home of one of our friends. We would talk for hours, often all night. Few of the speakers were working and everybody slept late. We women hobos often slept out on the grass all night, or we might sleep anywhere. Ina and I must have slept in 24 different houses or halls that first summer, although we always had our own room. Often I would bring a number of girls home with me, and occasionally a man would come. Girls and women of every variety seemed to keep Chicago as their hobo center. They came in bronzed from hitchhiking in khaki. They came in ragged in men's overalls, having ridden freights, decking mail trains, and riding the reefers or riding the blinds on passenger trains. They came in driving their own dilapidated Fords, or in the rattling sidecars of men hobos' motorcycles. A few of them even had bicycles. They were from the west, south, east, and north, even from Canada. They all centered about the near north side in Bughouse Square, and the cheap rooming houses and light housekeeping establishments, or begged or accepted sleeping space from men or other women there before them. Some of them had paid their own way on buses or passenger trains, but arrived broke to panhandle their food, or berths with men temporarily able to keep them. A few had been stowaways on lake boats. I remember one who said she stowed away on an airplane from Philadelphia. Not a few of them had their ways paid by charity organizations, believing their stories that they had relatives here who would keep them. On arrival, most of them were bedraggled, dirty, and hungry. Half of them were ill. There were pitiful older ones who had been riding rail freights all over the country with raging toothaches. In Chicago, they got themselves to clinics, and although they couldn't get any dental work done free, they could usually get the old snags of teeth taken out. Some were obviously diseased, and most of them were careless about their ailments unless they had overwhelming pain. The bulk of these women, and most all of the women on the road, I should say, traveled in pairs, either with a man to whom by feeling or by chance they had attached themselves, or with another woman. A few had husbands and children with them. There were a number of traveling with brothers. Now and then there was a group of college girls. A few women traveled about with a mob or a gang of men. These were of the hard-boiled, bossy type, usually who had careless sexual relations with anyone in their own group, and who, therefore, never had to bother to hunt for food or shelter. I do not remember, during the first years, seeing many pairs of lesbians come in off the road together, but of course they're common now. Women who are emotionally attached to each other, even though on the road or while they stop, they give their sex to men or to other women in exchange for food, transportation, and lodging. These women were out of every conceivable type of home. But even that first summer, I could see what I know now after many years, that the women who take to the road are mainly those who come from broken homes, homes where the father and mother are divorced, where there are stepmothers or stepfathers, where both parents are dead, where they have had to live with aunts and uncles and grandparents. At least half the women on the road are out on the road to get away from such homes. Many others, I have found, are graduates of orphan asylums. Shut up and held away from all activity, such girls have dreamed all their childhoods about traveling and seeing the world. As soon as they are released, they take to the quickest way to realizing their dreams and become hobos. Not a few are out of jails and institutions, choosing the road for freedom the same way, regardless of hardship. Among these are actually many paroled from institutions for the feeble-minded and insane. During my years in and out of Chicago, I talked to hundreds of these women. How had they managed without money on the road always fascinated me. Many worked from time to time. Some were typists, some file clerks, and carried with them recommendations from companies they had worked for. I knew one that first summer who was a graduate nurse. The only thing she carried with her on the road was a conservative-looking dress, which she could put on when she wanted to register for a job. She'd stay on a case, or a couple of cases, until she got a little money again, and then she'd pack the good dress away and go out on the road in trousers, hitchhiking. The bulk of women on the road made no pretense of working, however, even when they stayed for weeks, or even months, as they do in Chicago or any other big center. I've already explained how they get by begging, stealing, or hustling, or with help from the welfare agencies. Today, of course, all over the country, there are state relief stations, federal transient bureaus, travelers' aids office, but in the earlier days, the missions and the private charities would help transients, especially women. Some of the girls made a specialty of all the words and attitudes that went with being saved, and used them all successfully to get the watery soup and the coffee and the bread that were put out by rescue missions in the name of the Lord. Some of them made up circumstantial stories about their Jewish ancestry, being Irish, and got emergency help from Jewish agencies. Or they manufactured Roman Catholic backgrounds, being Jewish, and got help from Catholic missions. Others had acquired the language of various lodges and fraternal organizations, and in the name of fathers and brothers and uncles who were Mason, Moose, Woodmen, Kiwanians, and who were given food or clothes or money for transportation. But the great group of hobo women practiced none of these tricks. Most of them weren't clever enough. Instead, they begged from stores and in restaurants, from people on the road or on the city sidewalks. A lot of them didn't bother to beg rooms. If the weather was good, they slept in the parks with the men or alongside them, cleaning up in the morning in the toilets, the libraries, or other public buildings. And on the near north side, there were dozens of people in studios and rooming houses who wouldn't let any of them in, or who would let any of them in for a bath or cleanup. One of the roughest, toughest, and smuttiest flats we used to gather in was Toby's. Toby ran a bootleg joint on Hill Street, near the Elevated, and this side of hell there was no worse conglomeration of human beings. Toby was a rebel and a freethinker. He was tough and vulgar, a vicious, crooked, frightful sort of man. The vile, filthy language that he spouted, and the degrading way in which he handled his women, were almost unspeakable, but I doubt if any aristocratic apartment of wealthy bachelor in town attracted such a varied assortment of brains and talent as did Toby's lousy flat. Many of the best-known labor leaders, the ones who not only believed in, but practiced violence, came to his place for a loud drink, and quite a number of distinguished professors and literary men could be found there often. The poets, the real ones whose books did something for the community, came often. I shall never forget the first night that Lucille Donahue, the wife of the Star reporter Terry Donahue, brought me to Toby's. The place was stuffy and crowded with half-drunk men and soused women. Two of the heavy men, burglars, that I met that night were killed by policemen soon after. I despised Toby, with his heavy jaw and penetrating eyes, the moment I laid eyes on him. He leered at me, and I attempted to get his dirty hand under my dress before he had talked with me for 5 minutes. About 12 o'clock, 2 cabs stopped in front of the place, and a group of actors and newspapermen came in. Among them was Earl Ford, who was playing in the front page, and some of the stars from My Maryland. There was no piano, but there was music. There was no modesty or decency, but there was genuine intellectual activity. I was amazed at how clearly the drunken, brutal Toby could think. After Earl Ford downed a pint of Moon, he recited part of the Ballad of Reading Jail. I left the party with a bunch of actors. Ina refused to leave, and when her poet attempted to drag her out, Toby broke a china cuspidor over his head. And practically, every large city that I have visited, except those in the South, I found hobo colleges, unemployed councils, and radical forums that were run especially for the hobos and the unemployed. They were nothing new to me, but the most interesting of them all was one in Chicago, located in an old bank building at Washington and Des Plaines Street. The director was a physician, and the superintendent was John Burns, the bug house speaker I've already mentioned. For months I attended the meetings regularly. There were 3 each day, and one at 10 in the morning, the others 3 and 8 in the evening. The staff at the Hobo College was drawn from many walks of life, some of which had nothing to do with hoboing. It was here that I not only heard, but met Richard Bennett, the actor. He made a delightful and humorous speech and invited the whole audience to come to his play. We all loved him, and they knew what they wanted, and after the play we all ganged into his dressing room and had a grand time. Mary McCormick sang for us at the college, afterwards gave the superintendent $50 and sent him out to buy food for the crowd. Gilda Gray, the dancer, and her husband and publicity man came over and danced and sang for us. Her husband got a taxi and brought us some wonderful cakes from the swellest baker in town and a whole milk can of full steaming coffee. There were a good many authors at the college. Jim Tolley came and made an arrogant speech. He was short, ferocious, and red-headed, with a very dramatic manner. He brought with him Daniel Hennessy, a newspaper man who had written several good books on hobos for the Haldeman Julius Little Blue Books. Professor Nels Anderson, author of The Hobo and several other textbooks on sociology, also spoke to us. He had a strong, rugged, purposeful face and a rare way of telling a funny story, but the thing I remember most about him was a certain sweetness and tolerance that showed in his lips and in his voice as he talked of conditions on the road and of the things by which he and we had done and were then doing. Professor Edwin Sutherland, author of the splendid book on criminals, also gave us a fine talk. Besides these men, we heard some of the most noted professors and sociologists in America. Professor E. A. Ross of Madison, Professor E. W. Burgess of the University of Chicago, and Professor Herbert Bloomer, secretary under the American Sociological Society. Professor Bloomer was a former college football player, large and dominating in body, but with scholarly eyes and a quietness of manner. I am mentioning all these illustrious names to make it quite plain that the hobos are not a bunch of dumb ignoramuses, and that they have an interest in and capacity for good lectures and for worthwhile intellectual food. Besides having the finest type of teachers, the most profound professors, and the ablest adult educators came to Hobo College, the students themselves, the hobos, became able to think and talk more clearly. By far the most brilliant teachers and the most inspiring speakers who taught at the college belonged to us and came from the life we knew. One of them was Franklin Jordan, the man who would later become my heart. Although I saw Jordan every day and fell in love with him the very first time I saw him, we did not become intimate until much later. Pause. I had many jobs in Chicago that first year. One was as a typist and clerk in a big mail-order house. One was addressing envelopes for a politician, and the last was as an office girl for a woman physician, Dr. Hope Stone. Dr. Stone and I met at one of the radical forums and liked each other almost at once. She was small, decisive in manner, clean-cut in features. She asked me to work for her. She had an enormous practice and maintained an elaborate suite of offices in a large downtown building. There were on the staff besides myself a secretary, a nurse, a confidential clerk, her sister who looked after her finances, and 2 assistant physicians. Dr. Stone was an abortionist, now in business for herself, but once had been the assistant of Dr. Cooper. Old Dr. Cooper had been an abortion specialist for 30 years, and the rumor had it that he was averaged 10 curatages a day for the entire time. There is no proof of this, but if true, then he lessened the population by 100,000 souls in his lifetime. But even if it is only 1/2 or 1/4 true, he has more than 25,000 abortions to his credit. A number of people who are familiar with the abortion business in America told me that other men have performed even more than that number. There was not a single day during the 6 weeks that I worked for Dr. Stone in which there were less than 25 patients. They were not all operated on, but fully 2/3 were, an average certainly of 15 operations a day. On the same floor with Dr. Stone, there were 2 other abortionists, and in the same building 4 more. No one ever saw Dr. Stone operate. A patient came into the office. I took her name and address and asked who sent her to see the doctor. A large part of the doctor's practice was referred to her by other physicians. She kept one little cozy office down in the corridor, far away from the operating room, where she would meet the doctors who sent their patients, give them a drink and pay them their commissions. After I talked to the patient, I would admit her to the secretary's office, where the secretary and patient would talk over the business of the visit. It was a cash business, but not a cold and cruel cash business. Dr. Stone was kind and often operated for nothing, sometimes even giving the penniless patient some money from her own purse. After satisfactory financial arrangements were made, and an effort was made to get cash in advance, the patient was sent into the examining room. I saw over 600 patients in the 6 weeks of my stay there. The average fee was $50. Often, though, it was $25. A good many times it was $75, and sometimes $100. It was not unusual to get $150 or $200, nor was it rare to get $10, or nothing at all. Dr. Stone examined each patient herself. The kind of practice isn't at all hazardous if you can choose your patient, she told me. Most of the fatalities in interrupted pregnancies come from infections, and I have never yet had an infection. Nobody goes into our operating room who is not sterile, and the patients are prepared in the most careful manner. I always make an examination and a smear of a woman. If she is infected, I will not operate, and I never take a case after 4.5 months unless they can go to a hospital. Women who are weak or who have tumors or diseases, I refuse to operate on. I turn down 6 cases every day, no matter how much money or influence they may have. Dr. Stone interviewed all comers. I've seen policemen bring in their wives, and officials their stenographers. She didn't care who knew she was an abortionist. If they had the money and were physically fit for the operation, she took them. Everybody in the building knew what she was doing, and it seems that everybody in town knew it too. I asked Miss Jensen, one of her nurses, if there wasn't any danger to it. "Sure, there's danger," she answered me. "The police in City Hall knows what she's doing, but nearly all the men want a good, reliable abortionist at some time or another. Dr. Stone is careful, skillful, and she will operate for a low fee. Whenever any of the police court attaches or one of the state's attorney's men have a friend that needs an operation, they send her to the doctor, and she takes care of them without charge. They say that she pays a big graft, but I think it's a service to the powers that be. All she gives for protection. I've been with her for 5 years, and we've had only 4 deaths in all that time. That's much less than any doctor would have had if he treated half as many legitimate patients, and not a fifth as many deaths as for a doctor with an equal amount of full-term obstetrical cases. It's difficult to say what % of Dr. Stone's cases were married. They nearly all lied about it. The married women said they were single, and the single women said they were married, but I should say they were about half and half. I used to think that the doctor performed all the operations herself, but I learned, to my surprise, that she did not do a single one. She would examine the patient, and if everything was satisfactory, would take her into another room and put a sheet over her head. Then one of her assistant doctors would perform the operation. Quite often they would give the patient gas, and in that case the patient could never tell how long an operation lasted. That's the end of chapter 5. Please like and subscribe.